to Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival. I'm Jack Bulwer from Litquake, and our festival runs from October 7th through the 23rd right here at litquake.org. Tonight, we are honored to be able to present not only the film, The Capote Tapes, but also a conversation with its director, Yves Burnough, and the San Francisco Chronicle's Tony Bravo. This program is being co-presented by our good friends at SFFILM, who produce the San Francisco International Film Festival. We know Truman Capote as the iconic author of the books Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood, but his greatest masterpiece was meant to be a novel called Answered Prayers, an epic portrait of New York's glittering jet-set society. Instead, the book would spark his downfall, and it was only published after his death. This new documentary, The Capote Tapes, reveals the rise and fall of one of America's most influential writers and public figures back when writers were guests on television shows. This film uses new audio archives and interviews with Capote's famous friends and infamous enemies. Our special guest is the director of this film, Yves Burnough. Yves served as an advisor to First Lady Michelle Obama during the 2008 US presidential campaign, as well as Deputy White House Social Director to the Obamas during their first term. He has also held senior level campaign positions with, are you ready? New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley, and US Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York. He serves on the boards of the Actors Fund, Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago, and the Sundance Institute. Burnough is a graduate of Northwestern University, where he studied theater. The Capote Tapes is his documentary feature film debut. Yves will be in conversation here with Tony Bravo. Tony is the arts and culture reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he focuses on stories about the intersections of community, cultural trends, and aesthetics, and has also extensively covered LGBTQ issues. He has also reviewed Fashion Week for the Hearst newspapers, and since 2013 has been a journalism instructor in the fashion department at the City College of San Francisco. A few things before we begin, quick orders of big business. Don't forget to follow Litquake on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates. We also ask for your support of the Litquake organization to allow us to continue to bring you these events largely for free. It's a precarious time for artists and arts nonprofits right now, and if you believe in keeping literature a key component of San Francisco's cultural landscape, please consider dropping us a few bucks. Every bit helps. We accept donations at Venmo, PayPal, or directly at litquake.org. So let's get on with this show. Please welcome Yves and Tony.
Yves, hi. It is so great to be here with you. I have to say, first of all, I am a huge fan of Capote, and I'm now a huge fan of yours. Oh. How did you know that this was going to be your first ever documentary after that extraordinary political career that was just laid out in your intro?
Well, first of all, thank you. And it's great to be here with you. I'm excited. It's, I didn't know it was going to be my first documentary. I had no intention of doing a documentary. I was reading a book on the founding of CBS. And it was a book on Bill Paley called In All His Glory. And it's kind of a hefty tome. And by the time I got to the end of it, the two people that I was the most interested in were Babe Paley and Truman Capote. And it sent me kind of down a rabbit hole of rereading the works of Capote and doing some real research on Babe Paley, who I knew of, and I actually knew one of her daughters, but I didn't know, I wasn't really up to date on the relationship. And it just kind of sent me down a rabbit hole. And once I was down it, I kept saying, where's the in-depth examination of who Truman Capote was as a person? And that, the feature films were great, but they really focused on his writing of In Cold Blood. And so I was really curious about who the man was, what made him tick. And so that's when it just kind of became a project that I felt like I needed to see see through.
Well, we will get back to Babe Paley and the other swans a little bit later in the conversation. Please don't think I'm not going to ask about Mariella Agnelli and Gloria Vanderbilt and some of the other extraordinary voices that are in this documentary. But first, I'd love to know when you first encountered Capote in your life. Do you remember a first novella, a first reading assignment?
Yeah, it was actually not a reading assignment. I was a bit of a bookworm in school, and I grew up in the American South, in northern Florida, actually. And it's so funny. I was just yesterday talking to a good friend from childhood about this. And we had in our school, we had like the lower school librarian and the upper school librarian. And I spent most of my time with the upper school librarian, and her name, which I was trying to remember recently, is Mrs. Korst. And she would give me things to read, and I would go in and I'd be looking for books. And it's coming back to me as a memory that she gave me Miriam, Truman's short story Miriam, to read. And that kind of ushered in, from there, I just kept reading. And but it would be then, and I was pretty young. I would argue, I was trying to do the math. I would argue that I was probably 11 or 12. And I was just entranced by his writing.
I have to say, shouting out librarians and teachers is always good here at Litquake. Also for me, I think maybe 11 or 12, I checked out Breakfast at Tiffany's, the collection that's in.
That's right.
And then in high school, my high school librarian, Sheldon Atwater, and Susan Stoddard, who is the head of arts for the San Francisco Unified School District, both introduced me to additional Capote works in Cold Blood. And then eventually George Plimpton's book, which I need to read the title of because it's very long, Truman Capote, in which various friends, enemies, acquaintances, and detractors recall his turbulent career. It is a mouthful, but it is a great title.
It sums it up.
Absolutely. That book, as much as Capote's own writing, I think helped me get a better picture of the man, because it is told in the voices of some of these people we've mentioned. How did you come to then find the Plimpton book after knowing Capote? And then where does the discovery of the actual tapes or getting access to the Plimpton archive come in?
Yeah, the book I knew, and then I reread in research, and it became, dog-eared and like underlined, and it was just like an essential research piece for me. And then I was already working on the documentary, and a great family friend said to me, have you talked to Sarah Plimpton and all? And I said, no, and he was kind enough to make an introduction, and I spent quite a bit of time on the phone with Sarah, and quite a bit of time in person this is George's widow. And eventually she said to me, who is just extraordinary human being, and then eventually she said to me, I think I have some of these cassette tapes lying around, maybe they're at our house, somewhere in the attic. It was kind of like a far off thing. And she said, let me just see what I can find. And she eventually came with kind of boxes, several boxes of these, good old fashioned cassette tapes. And I started, well, first I had to find a way to play them because therein lies the rub. And so we had to have them digitized and then transcripts made. And then I started listening to them as well as reading the transcripts. And, that was a gold mine. And the Plimpton estate and Sarah in particular have been extraordinary partners in telling this story.
And then you get this other extraordinary person in the mix, Kate Harrington, whose father was Capote's lover. What was it like getting that story out? I mean, she's obviously open about it and has a great deal of affection, but I can't imagine it was easy in that era to have your father dating arguably one of the few kind of famous out gay men in the United States.
Yeah, and your father, who, you know, has, you know, I think there were 5 of them, you know, children and a wife, and I mean, it is a complex story. Um, Kate, you know, I through my research and reading, of course, I knew Kate existed, and then I set out on a journey to find her with my amazing research team, and we found her. And then I remember my first conversation with her, and she was living at the time in a very small town in Wyoming. And she said, "I haven't really talked about any of this in 30 plus years. Uh, I loved Truman. I'm ready to talk about it, but you have to make me," you know, she said, "you have to make a promise to me." And I said, "What is that?" She said, "You have to just tell the full story. You can't only tell the sad parts of the story because there was so much good there and the end is so sad." She said, "I know you have to tell the sad part, but just please tell the full story." And I made her a promise that I would tell the full story. And I got on a plane with my crew, and we flew, you know, it was like planes, trains, and automobiles to this small town in Wyoming, and had an amazing interview. And she has since, I will tell you, become an incredible friend that I just had lunch with 2 weeks ago, and is just an extraordinary individual in her own right. But she has an amazing story, which she is, which I think I can say, is she is actively working on her own memoir, because I think she has a story that's one that really needs to be told.
Hearing her story, I thought Netflix series.
Yeah,
It's
no,
like Eloise at the
extraordinary.
Plaza,
It's exactly,
but it's Truman Capote instead of Nanny.
totally.
I mean, the fact that he introduces her to Richard Avedon and gets her into modeling, it is all at once a very unusual situation and kind of a fantasy situation. The story that you get to tell from her in this.
Totally. It's an amazing, it is Eloise. It's a great fairy tale in some ways. And what's extraordinary about her is that she took all of the right things from him, which were both intellectual as well as artistic, as well as social. And I think that's, for me, as when I met Kate, that was for me one of the things that completely changed my thinking about the film, because I walked into the film not having a really strong position one way or another on Truman. I didn't like him, but I didn't dislike him. I thought he was brilliant, and I thought there was a story to tell. My production team, by and large, not by and large, they all really didn't like him. Everybody felt like he was mean, he betrayed his friends, it was all of these grievances that kind of stacked up against Truman. And by the end of the process, that entire production team were madly in love with him. And I think part of the reason that happened, and by the way, I didn't fall in love with him, but part of the reason that happened was Kate changes the dynamic of how we think about this person, because Truman was incredibly brilliant and tricky and nasty and pointed when he wanted to be, but he was also a really insecure gay man at a time when that was extraordinarily difficult, and in constant search of love and affection, and wanted a family. And that just wasn't, you know, I'm a father of 4, that just, a gay father of 4, that just wasn't something that you could take for granted. And he was determined to create his family, and that to me is extraordinary. And she opened up the heart to me.
The heart of Truman, as it were.
She opened up the heart.
all those contradictions that you mentioned, being beloved, being despised, being captivating, being terrible, being generous, and being extraordinarily cruel at times. I feel like any successful project about Capote has to really straddle the lines between all those things, because according to many different people, he could be any of those things at any moment, or sometimes all at once.
All at once, exactly.
There's also this extraordinary, unusual presence that he projected in almost every era that he inhabited. You, of course, talk about the extraordinary figure he cut as a very young man, I think in his late teens, as a copy boy at the New Yorker. He was this diminutive, fair-haired, with an extraordinarily high voice that we've now heard multiple actors mimic in a couple of film projects. There were not other people like Truman Capote in the world, and there especially weren't in the literary world, it feels like. How did you pick and choose the voices that could best paint the picture of how this person kind of floated through these times that were not hospitable to him? You had not only these incredible people available from the Plimpton tapes, but your cast list is pretty extraordinary too.
Yes, that's a great question. There were, certainly from the tapes, there were a lot of voices. One of the things we were up against in terms of live interviews was that a lot of the voices were falling away, were passing away. And so I will say I had a Liz Smith, who of course was this extraordinary gossip columnist in New York. And when I first started working on the project, I went to Lizzie and we sat down and she said, let me tell you, this is how it works. Like Mrs. Paley and Mr. Paley and Truman, and I was there for this. And by the time I got back and I was really ready to shoot, lesson learned, it was a first time film documentary director mistake. I should have gone there with a crew. But by the time I got back to her a couple of months later, she wasn't in great shape and she wasn't able to be interviewed, and she passed away not long after. So it was a struggle to capture live storytellers who were really intimately in the mix. But the through line of what I was looking for were people who could speak to, or voices, should I say, that could speak to the different elements. Because to me, Truman was a bit like Mr. Potato Head. Do you know what I mean? You had to give each person, because he could speak for himself in certain clips and in certain interviews, but you had to give the brain, you had to give the heart, you had to give the arms, you had to give the snarkiness. There were all these things that you had to put together. And so, you know, Slim Keith, who of course was one of the Swans, who felt terribly betrayed by Truman, and who when interviewed by Plimpton, does a bit, when you listen, you know, as I was listening to all of these interviews, does a bit of an attempt at rewriting history. You know, she doesn't want to seem like she was had, you know, Truman he was nasty, he was vicious, he was, you know, but they were friends not for 5 or 10 years. These are people who were friends for almost 30 years. It was, and she knew he was a writer. She got, I don't want to say taken in. I think she was lulled into a sense of safety and security with Truman. And she thought, he'll never write that about me, or he'll never write that about Babe. And so as I went through the voices, it was about rounding him out. It was about having John Richardson, who could speak to what it was like to be a contemporary of his and a friend, and someone who, you know, they really played in the same sandbox, versus, you know, hearing Slim Keith's voice or hearing from, you know, Dotson Rader. You know, each person I hoped gave something that was missing to kind of illuminate the person.
I have to say, one of my favorite and slightly unexpected interviews in this is Andre Leon Talley, who owns the iconic Capote couch.
Yes.
He was a wonderful voice to include in there, especially to also knowing that he is somebody who has an extraordinary career, who took inspiration in some ways, or found aspects of the more positive parts of Capote's life to reference in his own work. I wanted to ask about your career before documentary filmmaking. I think about this rarefied world that Capote and frankly people like Andre Leon Talley have moved in with the swans, the socialites, the extraordinary celebrity women and wives of celebrities. Do you feel that your time at the White House as the social director in any way maybe gave you an insight into the manners of that scene, or just some of the vulnerability of some of these high-powered people? I think one of the things you really illuminate here is that some of the women really found a kinship because there was an emptiness in their life. That's where Truman sort of filled that void for them.
You know, I've done some thinking about that. I think my time at the White House in particular, and when I was deputy social secretary, was certainly a unique insight. It was a bit of a specific insight into Washington and the mechanisms of politics and power and all that becomes. And I think Washington by nature, by being a very much a company town, is a little bit different than New York and London, because everybody in Washington is really working towards the same, or maybe not the same, but they're working towards goals that are based around power and policy and politics, those three little P's. What I will say my time there taught me, that I think I brought to this film, not knowing it until much, much, much later, was that I got to Washington thinking of myself as a Black gay man, thinking of myself as those two things not being the assets that they are. I mean, that was a long time ago. I was quite young. I was 27, 28. But I looked at those things. I didn't look at them as negatives or detractors, but I thought to myself, oh God, like, you know, I'm this politician, you know, doesn't want to sit next to me because I'm not running the policy shop, which I had run, you know, on other campaigns. Or this, there was an insecurity that I arrived in some ways with, particularly about both, not individually, but the combined force of my sexual orientation and my race. And what I realized in that process was that those turned out to be my greatest assets in that situation, because what I had the ability to do was see everything. And I had the ability in some ways, and I think this is what I took into it and what I learned a bit about Truman. I had the ability also to be, no one was threatened by me. I wasn't the strapping white heterosexual male that was trying to demand X. I wasn't the beautiful wife of someone that was worried about whether someone was wearing the same ball gown that I was wearing, or whether someone was upping me, or whether I was in competition with the first lady. I was kind of this neutralized force that could see everything, and as such had not only incredible insight, but as a result, I had so much more information, because no one deems you as a threat. I wasn't deemed in those circles at the time as someone that was threatening. And as a result, you actually have the ability to amass a great deal of information, a great deal of power. And that was something that it took me time at the White House to understand, that who I was a really strong, every aspect of me was an incredible benefit. And when I started working on this film, I thought all these people thought of Truman as this little gay Southern boy. And actually what he was a super, super smart, super savvy person who could blend into the scenery and not seem like a threat. But if he wanted to be, could really cut you. And I think that's where I learned something.
I feel also when you say that, that is one of the things that writers and filmmakers and artists get to do, perhaps especially queer or artists of color or artists from any marginalized or intersectional identity get to have, is that we are sometimes taken for granted, or we can recede into the background when there are more obviously powerful or important people there. And what we see in the background, it's a documentary, it's a newspaper story, it's answered prayers, the few chapters we have of it.
Exactly. And I will tell you, I think that it wasn't until working on this film that I really understood how much I'd taken away from that time in Washington, and what I'd learned about myself and how I could see elements of what he must have been going through. And he was in a far more restrictive era than I was, certainly.
That I keep coming back to, the idea that you and I get to be gay men in the 21st century. Yeah. Most of my time has been in this century. It's a much easier time. I mean, it's easier in 2021 than it was in 2000. Certainly, he was Truman Capote full out in the 1960s, essentially, the 50s even. I keep returning to the fact that not only was this a time when writers were on talk shows frequently, but Truman Capote might have been the only queer voice, and what a queer voice in many ways, that a young queer person could be hearing on television, on the Dick Cavett Show, on Johnny Carson. I mean, there was no more a mainstream token of acceptance than the Johnny Carson Tonight Show.
Totally. He was, and I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't start this project and I didn't end this project being in love with Truman. I have to be really honest about that. He has demons that spending a number of years working on something about someone like this, you can't escape those demons, and you don't want to live with them. But in the LGBTQ plus canon, I think he is lost in some ways, in part because of that celebrity. I mean, you're right. This is an era when writers were on talk shows, and he was on talk shows like beyond belief. And as a result of that, and I also think as a result of his sexuality and of his uniqueness in terms of that voice and everything about him, it's outrageous to me that Truman didn't win the Pulitzer. It's the literary community viewed him, though they realized and acknowledged the brilliance of his writing, there was a lack of a desire to fully reward him. I think he had 2 O. Henry prizes, but when you look at In Cold Blood, come on, that's the definition of work that's Pulitzer worthy. And Truman was just a little too much for that group at that time. And that's, that became a passion of mine in terms of this project. It became a passion to remind people to download or pick up, whatever you prefer, the books and reread because they're extraordinary. But also, this was a queer voice in an era when that was so virtually impossible, and he was who he was. And I think we've lost the ability to, or not the ability, we've just lost him, and then our ability to be able to say he was courageous and he was out front. And I hope that's something people take away from the film. I hope people look up and say, gosh, I didn't know that, or I hadn't realized that, and we should maybe give that a little more of a shine.
I think you do explore all of those different contrasting qualities. The innovator, the pioneer, he invented a genre within Cold Blood. I'm certainly not the only person to say that. We did not have, I believe it's a nonfiction novel, was the term that you preferred.
Yes.
Right, we didn't have that. I mean, and now everything from, I don't know, every true crime book that's out there and things as lauded as Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, I think, can directly look back at that book.
And I go beyond, I think you're right. And I always press people because I always say, what do you think Law and Order is?
Basically.
No, really. I mean, so much of the genres that we watch now are based on a true story that we are embellishing a little bit, that we're giving different contours for. This is all derivative of what he created. And that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, I often think to myself, what would he be saying if he were here now? And I think he'd probably, be amazing on social media, but I think he'd also be like, hey, Dick Wolf, where's my cut? Where are my royalties?
I would love to imagine Truman Capote on Twitter sometime with you. I think it would be extraordinary what he could do with that number of characters. Another area where I really see him ahead of his time is in fashioning his own celebrity persona. I mean, we're a world that is defined by that now. We have so many social media outlets in which celebrities and regular people can push out sort of their presentation of theirself, those talk show appearances, his public speaking engagements, even the way he presented himself in the author photo on the back of Other Voices, Other Rooms, that famous reclining shot, all seems just so clairvoyant about how much persona and celebrity seem to rule every kind of cultural sphere in our country right now, including literature. But yes, I agree with you very much that perhaps being ahead of his time in that, perhaps the celebrity quality that he had made him not taken seriously by some of the gatekeepers at places like the Pulitzer.
100%. It's just very, and I also think, look, it was a different era, obviously, but we can't let these things go. We have to, we're not letting them go in so many moments in history right now. We're being reminded, and we're reminding people. And I think Truman, and by the way, I want to go back and say, not a perfect person, by the way.
Not a perfect person.
Not a perfect person. I do not
Far from it.
I do not want to, promote that. But a person who deserves, I think, a bit more credit and a bit more of a place in the canon for what he did and who he was.
Well, perfect people are bad documentary subjects, and I doubt they're interesting writers.
I agree.
Okay, so let's really get to one of, I think, the most controversial and mysterious parts of Capote's career. And that is the unfinished, undiscovered, possibly novel, Answered Prayers. This is a topic that obsessed me when I really first got into Plimpton's book. The idea that there could be some safe deposit box that one of Johnny Carson's ex-wives might have had a key to that had this missing, as he described it, Proustian epic of social manners and hypergamy of people going in and out of their stations and epic climbs and falls. When did you sort of know that this was going to have to be a significant part of this documentary?
I knew early on, I have to say, I knew early on it had to be a big part because it's it's such a big part of his life. You know, I mean, it wasn't a project, it wasn't a book that he was only working on for like 3 or 4 years. It was a book that he really was talking about for about 20
Yeah, for
years.
decades, really.
Yeah, he was really talking about this book for decades. And so it was always something that he was working on. And of course, Kate talks about seeing him writing it. You have other friends who would say, oh, he would, you know, people who believe that he would make up elements or plot lines from the book in his head over a cocktail with them. And they didn't necessarily believe that he had written any of it down, that it was just, you know, made up on the spot. But I knew early on that it was a big part because it was a major chunk of his life. It was essentially his downfall. It was also his ultimate betrayal of his very dear friends. It was too big not to play a significant place. And whether or not the book, look, I personally believe that he wrote the book. I'm not necessarily sure that it ended up in a deposit box, but I could see him, there are stories about him losing it in a limo at one point, and then the driver having to bring it back to the plane. I mean, there's all sorts of stories, but I think what I found to be the highlight that I hope comes through in the film is that this was all, particularly the last 10 years, this was all during a period in his life when he was severely addicted to drugs and alcohol. And as such, he wasn't able to be the writer or the custodian of his own great literature the way that he was able to be in the past. And I think that for me is one of the saddest elements of the story, because you read the few chapters, and I think George Plimpton even says on the tapes, Truman is terribly witty or funny. I mean, it's interesting. It's captivating. It is not the level of In Cold Blood. It is not the level of Breakfast. And so I attribute a lot of that to his deep decline into drugs and alcohol and what that was doing to him. So highlighting that book was also an important part of highlighting his decline.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only certainly where the publication of the few chapters in magazine form, absolutely the end of his life in the jet set with many of these women and their husbands who had been really surrogate family to him. But there is that quality, like Plimpton said, it is very witty, but it is not at the level of A Breakfast at Tiffany's, of The Grass Harp, of the incredibly beautiful and compelling Christmas Memory. It is it's also very pointed. Mm-hmm. It's very mean in places. The lunch chapter, Litquake Bass, is extraordinarily revealing and at times cruel, I think, in some of the dialogue the women have in that scene. And I agree, it is part of having to paint the overall more complicated picture of him. Did you get a sense from the tapes or from your own research that he felt in any way like entitled to be able to write these stories? I remember there being a quote where he said, like, what did you think I was doing all these years? Like, I'm a writer. I was just sitting there not paying attention. I mean, did it really hurt him that he was cut off from those women?
I think he definitely felt entitled to tell the story, without question, to tell those stories, plural. I think it did hurt him to be cut off from them. I think it really hurt him to be cut off from Babe Paley. I mean, I think that was a devastation. The others, I think he had mixed feelings about, is Morella really that, beautiful? is this one really that smart? Is this one really that interesting? I think he had mixed feelings, but Babe, I think, was really a devastation. Yeah, I think he felt really like it was his story to tell. It was in the public domain. And they were, by the way, look, they were very public people. These were not wallflowers. So I think he felt like it was his story to tell. I also think he didn't think through how lonely it would be when they left.
I take it almost as a decision akin to, Oscar Wilde filing the lawsuit. Like, what did you think was going to happen? I mean, Proust disguised things quite a bit more.
Yes.
He does, certainly do some different names for people. He does create characters, but he also very directly references real events. The Ann Woodward shooting being a good example. He also uses real names. I think Gloria Vanderbilt is actually mentioned.
Yes, totally, as Lee Radziwill.
Lee Radziwill also, yes.
Yes.
Who was, I think, another woman he was extraordinarily close to, whose cutting off the friendship really hurt, from what I understand.
Yes, I think, again, though, I think one of the complex things here and about him and his writing is that his writing was about real life and breakfast, and I think it goes to the conversation we were just having, which is about the quality of the writing, because when you read Breakfast at Tiffany, it's not Holly Golightly is not at the end of the book. When you finish the book, you don't think to yourself, I wish I were her.
No, certainly not.
You don't think that. And yet, after the book, and certainly after the film, you had numerous New York socialites saying, Holly Golightly was really based on me. And, when you think about In Cold Blood, and you think about, what the mountain that he climbed, what that writing was, the true story, that true crime genre that we were talking about. Again, the writing is so exceptional that you want to be a part of it. You want to be a part. You want to be a character in the story that this person who writes the best sentences, as Mailer says, you want to be a part of that story. And I think that was something that was a part of Truman from childhood. I can't remember, maybe he was 8 or 9, and he wrote an essay for the town newspaper, and it was titled Mrs. Busybody.
Mrs. Busybody, of course. His first public scandal.
And it was about Harper Lee's mother, actually.
He didn't just spill the tea, he spilled the sweet tea, I think.
But he spilled the sweet tea. But that's who he was. You know what I mean? And I think the struggle that the Swans and that stratosphere, that group in that stratosphere experienced was, they didn't realize he would go so far. And I think he probably would not have gone so far had it not been for his descent into alcohol and drugs in the same way. I think that lessened. I think the writing would have been pointed, but I think it would have been a bit more, nuanced. And I think that's one of the struggles with Answered Prayers.
One of the sort of suppositions that I feel is made in many of the biographies, and frankly in both of the biopics of Capote, is that after writing In Cold Blood, and possibly also because of a strong attachment he had to Perry Smith, and then following the famous Black and White Ball, which you also go into beautifully with some fantastic archive images in the documentary, that he really perhaps reached a crisis. The level of fame that he had was certainly extraordinary, the level of acclaim he was getting, but also this was a very emotionally taxing long invested project. Certainly we know that people like Dr. Max Jacobson were the Dr. Feelgood of his era, were popular among his set. We know that alcohol was consumed in a very different way in the middle 20th century than I think it is now. Do you feel like after In Cold Blood was sort of the turning point for him, where the beginning of the descent starts? I have mixed feelings about it because I do feel that there was great work that was produced after that. I think Music for Chameleons is a great example of it. I'd love your thoughts.
No, I agree. I think Music for Chameleons, I mean, look, there was great work. There was great work done after that, but I do think, yes, it was the beginning of the end. And when you listen, I mean, we have a bit of it in the film. I think it's from Slim Keith, where she says when he came back and he was, I can't remember how she phrases it, but she says he was literally undone. Yes, he did have, for all intents and purposes, he had a breakdown after In Cold Blood, after the executions, after the, it was, look, it was 6 years of work. It was taxing. There was certainly an emotional attachment, and look, he needed the book to come to an end. And I don't know, like, I think we underestimate it's a bit like Master Builder. I think we underestimate what it means when we think something needs to happen, and then when it does happen, and how we actually put the weight of the reality on ourselves. Like, this concept of like, I need them to die for the book to come to its conclusion. And that's what you need. And then it happens. I think we underestimate as humans how we take, did I put that out into the universe too much, and now it's happened, and now is that somehow on me? And I think there are elements of that are certainly in Truman. And he came back from Kansas really depleted. And of course, then the Black and White Ball, which is the best marketing turn in American history. Certainly one of the best. I mean, this concept of, I'm going to invite my doorman, I'm going to invite Princess so-and-so, and I'm going to invite Rose Kennedy, and I'm going to have 400 people in the ballroom, and you're all going to wear masks, and you can't take them off until midnight because that might deter who you dance with. I mean, when you really think about that. So, and by the way, I have to have a guest of honor, but I need someone not too fabulous like the Swans, but important enough. So I'll make it Kay Graham, and I'll say
Kay Graham, very powerful,
very powerful. And you're still devastated over your husband. And Kay kept saying, I'm okay. And he kept saying, you need a party. And you need a party. So, I think post In Cold Blood, he did that master turn with the Black and White Ball, and he did create this persona. He not created, but he further enhanced this persona that he had already created. But I do believe it was the beginning of his downfall.
Ibs, one of the things that I think really crystallized for me in a new way after all these years of reading Capote with your documentary was something that I believe Andre Leon Talley said towards the end, that really his most beautiful work, his most affecting work, was work that he wrote about people that were not very powerful. Mm-hmm. I mentioned A Christmas Memory earlier, which is, I think, one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing in the American canon. Cousin Sook is not a powerful person. Holly Golightly, please cast the image of Audrey Hepburn out of your head for this. She is a runaway child bride from Appalachia who is subsisting as a call girl, essentially. That is not a powerful person. The killers and the family and In Cold Blood are not powerful people. But then the work that Capote did that ended up being his downfall was really focused on the people that are sort of at the top of the socioeconomic food chain here. I would love your thoughts on this. I mean, do you feel that he was at his best when he was writing about people that were essentially as vulnerable as he was?
It's a terrific question. I think he was at his best. Well, I think the work is certainly at its best when it's authentic and there's not an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think when you look at how the character of Holly Golightly, there's not an agenda to say she's this or she's that, or she should be this or she should be that. It's just to say, this is her story. This is it's simple. It's as simple as that. And I think that's something, as a person who also grew up in the American South, that's something that I think we're taught in our everyday life, I think, and it's something that we do really well, which is just keep it simple, like tell the story. And when he does that, the work is beautiful and brilliant because it's authentic. I think certainly with Answered Prayers, I think certainly with the life, and his longtime partner, Jack Dunphy, felt this way early on when Truman was getting involved with the Swans and getting involved with the jet set. It all became a bit inauthentic. Not that he wasn't being himself, but there was an agenda. It was like, I want to get to here, or I want to prove this, or I want to know that. And I think that's where his work starts to get messy. The beautiful work is work that's just telling about the human condition. It's about, you know, it's about, this is who this girl, and I'm going back to Holly Golightly, but it could be, you know, again, in Cold Blood, this is who this family in Kansas, this is who they were. This is who these people were. And, you know, in Kansas, that family incidentally was quite prominent, you know, I mean, but then he turns and he says, and this is how they were murdered. And this also is who these murderers are and what their story is. And by the way, he had this constant thing of, you know, there go I, but for the grace of God, in regard to Perry. He thought that Perry could easily have been who he would have turned out to be if his life, he could have easily turned out to be Perry if his life hadn't been different. And so I think there's when the work focuses on humanity, when the work focuses on the human condition, it's flawless. When he starts to try and set out an agenda, when he starts to try and say, I'm going to get back at him for being a bad husband, or I'm going to get back at her for being, you know, a horrible individual, or for whatever the case may be, that's when the work starts to falter, I think.
Ebes, it is an extraordinary film. The film is the Capote Tapes. I hope that when you do your next documentary, whatever that might be, that we get a chance to come back here together at Litquake and talk about that one too.
Well, I hope so too. And thank you so much for having me.
It has been a delight talking Truman Capote with you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you on behalf of Litquake for having us.
Thank you.